Listeners, it gives me great pleasure to have Audrey Tushke on our program today, Kehte Sunte on 89.3 2GLF FM, coming to you from Sydney. Audrey is a historian, author, and activist. She's an associate professor of South Asian history at Rutgers University in New York. She is the author of two award-winning books, Cultures of Encounters, Sanskrit in the Mughal Court, and Aurangzeb, The Man and the Myth. And that's a book that I've thoroughly enjoyed reading. And I welcome Audrey to the show on Zoom, maintaining social distance. Welcome to the show, Audrey. Thank you for taking the time out for us.
Thanks for having me on the show, Mabir.
So before we start, let me confess that I'm slightly nervous because I'm not a historian. You're a historian of repute. And I read in your book that, or somewhere where you said that history is not in your blood, it's in your training. Now, just because I have Indian and Sikh heritage does not mean that I will have access to the history or to understand history the way it really happened. But coming back to Aurangzeb, your favorite character from the Indian Mughal period, tell me, what do you think about him? I mean, as all human beings are, Aurangzeb was also a very complex character. Tell us about him. It's intriguing to know what you think of him.
So my sort of historical biography of Aurangzeb Alamgir argues that he was a pre-modern Indian king, which, to be perfectly honest, is a somewhat boring argument for historians, but tends to ruffle the feathers of at least some non-historians who would prefer, instead of understanding him in historical terms, to simply judge and condemn him, whether it's as a bigot or a zealot or whatever else they, sort of monstrous thing they think that he might have been. My preferred approach to him is a slightly less emotional one, and in that sense, I would take objection to your description of him as my favorite character in Indian history. It's not that I like Aurangzeb Alamgir; it's that I ask different questions about him. I think that he was a critical figure in South Asian history. I think that he changed the shape of Hindustan forever. I understand why and how.
So, coming from the United States of America, how did you develop this interest in studying Sanskrit and Persian and a bit of Braj? These are fairly complex and difficult languages. So where did you develop this interest in pursuing these languages and South Asian history?
So, I wish I had a better story, but honestly, I just started taking classes in college, and it started with Sanskrit. That was sort of my first love. And when I discovered the vast depth of Sanskrit literature and poetry, I was just absolutely blown away. And Sanskrit literature is relatively understudied in the West compared to Shakespeare or something like that. And so I thought, why not do this? Why not make a career of it? And then I learned Persian and I learned some Braj, and the next thing I'm basically only qualified to be a professor of South Asian history. I came to Aurangzeb a little bit later, and that actually had to do with some public comments that I made regarding my first book, which does not concern Aurangzeb. It ends with his ascension to the throne. And I gave an interview to The Hindu, major newspaper in India, and I said all this stuff that I thought was controversial and edgy about Emperor Akbar. No one cared. I said 2 lines about Emperor Aurangzeb that I thought were completely boilerplate. No one would object. And I felt like the entire world started screaming in my face. And I realized then that historians have progressed on how we think about Aurangzeb Alamgir, and no one had translated that for a wider audience. And so I thought, why not try my hand at it? And Aurangzeb, the Man and the Myth, was the result of that.
So I read in your book that the demonization of Aurangzeb started with the British, and the British represented him as a villain, and they were there in shining armor to come and rescue their colonial subjects, the Indians. And after that, we'll talk about the demonization of Aurangzeb by the Hindutva or the right-wing nationalists that's happening across the country at the moment. So tell us, where did this demonization start, and what was the motivation for the British to do that?
Sure. So the basic story here is that the British roll into India and they start setting up shop. They start with colonial rule, first with company rule, later with the British Raj, direct rule by the crown. And they have a really hard sell job. because colonialism was a horrific enterprise. It was racist, it was exploitative. I mean, it was just horrible. And the British were never in India in particularly large numbers, and so they needed the cooperations of large numbers of Indians. How do you sell something that is terrible for an entire population? And the British had many strategies for that. And one of them was to say, hey, at least we were better than the guys who came before. And the Mughals were the sort of biggest, most obvious rulers that came before them. And of the Mughals, if you're going to pick one to demonize, you go with Aurangzeb, right? He ruled for a long time. He expanded the empire. You know, even in those days, anti-Muslim sentiments were a thing in the world, not quite like today, but in a different way. You know, the fact that he does appear to have been more pious and more of a practicing Muslim than perhaps some of his ancestors, all of that could then be marshaled to say, look how bad Aurangzeb was. We, the British, are your saviors, right? And so that's sort of where it started, was basically colonial propaganda. Some of that was disguised as scholarship. And, you know, we still use British era scholarship today, right? You know, and, you know, especially when you don't check for colonial biases, and not everyone does, especially people who aren't trained in history and historical method, then those biases can continue into the present. And they still serve political purposes today, not for the British, but for Hindu nationalists.
So that's a very interesting take, that these were not true historians, and they operated with a bias. And we all know that there are, I mean, it's very difficult to shake off bias with historians, and unless they consciously go out and do that. But as a layperson, how do we differentiate between an unbiased or a true historian and a biased or a propaganda historian? For example, right now in India, Dinanath Batra and his ilk are saying that Romila Thapar is not a true historian. And while Dinanath Batra doesn't have the same credentials that Romila Thapar would have. So how do we, as lay people, decide on, yeah, this is a historian to follow and this is a historian not to follow?
Absolutely. So you can start with some real general questions. Who is this person and what are their qualifications, right? Their qualifications mainly have to do with where they grew up or what their heritage is. I would argue that that's not especially the most relevant thing, right? You're looking for degrees for who trained them, and, you know, what, you know, are they publishing peer-reviewed scholarship? Are they not? That sort of thing. Ultimately, I think that the arguments should stand or fall on their own merits, however, right? And perhaps a crucial thing here is to emphasize that it's rarely all or nothing. In fact, it essentially is never all or nothing. Just because a historian may have certain biases in some ways does not invalidate her work entirely. I still cite British era scholars of South Asia, right? You know, the work is not completely worthless because they had certain biases. And Jadunath Sarkar is a great example of this, right? I mean, he wrote the most on Aurangzeb of anybody ever in history. And, you know, his work is deeply flawed, it's deeply communalist, and it's also incredibly detailed and based on primary sources. It's invaluable. And so, you know, you have to sort of sort through these things. And while I think that training in history is very important, I believe in it as a specialized discipline. There's a reason why it takes, you know, 7-8 years to get a PhD in this field. I do think that non-historians, lay people, can do a fair amount of this work, right? You know, you just have to exercise critical thought and be willing to challenge your own ideas.
So in India, there are lots of self-professed historians who are shaping the way people read history. And these are not people who've been trained, but they have an interest in history, and they pick up history and they start writing about it from their perspective. There's, as a historian who the Indian Hindutva movement doesn't like, you cop a lot of flack on Twitter. And but how do we, as ordinary Indians, reshape the way we have been looking at Aurangzeb? For instance, he killed his brothers, he imprisoned his father. Even if you talk about the Sikh gurus, he went about killing our Sikh gurus because of his focus on conversion. When the Sikh gurus did not convert, he killed them. Now, these are the narratives that we've grown up with. He imposed jizya on non-Muslims, which is a tax for non-Muslims. He destroyed thousands of temples. And I also read that Eaton, a source that you quote, who says that he did not destroy more than 12 temples in all. But how do we, as ordinary Indians, we grew up on stories and narratives of demonizing Aurangzeb, and that he converted, he killed. And suddenly, how do we, as ordinary Indians, change our opinion about Aurangzeb? It's really hard.
So I think the first thing that you have to be willing to do, you have to be willing to challenge the ideas that you grew up with. And in some cases, I think that's very difficult for people, right? These are things that your parents might have told you and that your grandparents might have told you. Particularly for Sikh communities, this is often embedded in a faith-based narrative that can be very difficult to challenge. And, as a historian, I offer one way of viewing the past. And for people who don't want a historical way of viewing the past, my honest answer is just don't listen to me, right? If you want to stick with a more faith-based view, or whatever you inherited, I have nothing to say to you. But for people who want to sort of know better what happened, I think the starting points are as follows. One, you look at the facts, right? Did Aurangzeb Alamgir, in fact, embark on some large-scale mission to convert everyone to Islam? The answer is no. There's no evidence of that. And there's pretty substantial historical evidence of small-scale conversion during his reign. He would get these daily news reports, right, sent from, various parts of his empire. It's like pre-modern tweets or something, right? And they would say sometimes the names of people who had converted. When you're naming people who had converted, you're dealing with like pretty small numbers, like single digits usually. It suggests there was no, large scale imperial thing, right? Aurangzeb, he was essentially a king who happened to be Muslim more than he was a Muslim who happened to be king, right? Being king came first for him. The thousands of temples, he didn't destroy thousands of temples. We know about a dozen. Now, there may have been more, but to go from a dozen to 1,000, maybe a few dozens more likely there. Another thing you can do is you can look at context. It's true, he imprisoned his father for 7.5 years, right? He put Shah Jahan on like a long-term lockdown, to put it in very modern terms. But, you have to think about why he did that, right? He wasn't the first Mughal emperor who did that. Shah Jahan had killed several of his brothers. He'd killed some nephews, some cousins. Multiple of earlier Mughal kings had tried to overthrow their fathers, they were just unsuccessful. Now that doesn't mean that we give Aurangzeb a pass and say, oh, well, it was all okay. But it does mean that we understand that he was acting as a normal Mughal king would. And whether you or I think that that's just is irrelevant, right? What I care about as a historian is explaining his actions.
And Audrey, you were saying that he would have destroyed at most maybe a handful of temples. And so what was the reason for doing this, even though there was no official orders to destroy temples? And you say in your book that the Hindu kings had started this tradition of destroying temples of enemy kings. Let's talk about that.
So yes, so the idea of sort of ransacking somebody else's temple, this was a Hindu idea originally on the subcontinent. Muslim kings took it to a new level in a sense. They would often destroy the entire temple as opposed to simply desecrate it, although they desecrated as well. Key to understanding this is as follows. Temples were sites of political authority in pre-modern India. And that is very difficult for many people to even conceptualize today, much less stomach, because in modern society, the temple, the gurdwara, the masjid, these are sacred places, right? They are supposed to be set apart from politics. And that was simply not true in pre-modernity, right? A king's authority was embedded in a temple. And that continued all the way through the Mughal period. And so when you hit a temple, there may have been religious connotations to that in certain points, but there were certainly political connotations to it. It was considered to be an acceptable way to hit back at a community or another ruler who was attempting to push back against your political authority. And again, we don't have to like that. We don't have to think that that's nice and pretty, but it does explain why did Aurangzeb destroy that temple and not that one. Right? You look at Benares today, you're tripping over temples. Why didn't he destroy all of them? Right? That's a question that historians have to answer. Why this temple and not the 10 others on the block?
And a similar view could be taken about the allegation that he wanted to convert the whole of India into Muslim. Then what is the reason that we still have Hindus and Sikhs and others who are in majority there. And you seem to be right when you say that a lot of Hindus converted to Islam because it gave them access to more jobs and a brighter future. Is that true?
I don't know if I would say that. So there were certain jobs that could only be held by Muslims in Aurangzeb's empire. There was a class of tax collectors for the jizya who had to be Muslim to be in that class. I don't know if they were particularly welcoming of converts in that upper echelons anyways. In general, Aurangzeb had no problem employing Hindus, at least up to a certain number within the imperial nobility. And he actually employed more Hindus by a significant margin as compared to Shah Jahan, Jahangir, and Akbar, right? The three kings before him. And that's not because Aurangzeb liked Hindus or he wanted them to do well. It's because he incorporated more Hindu majority lands into his empire, particularly as he expanded south and brought more Maratha areas under his control. So the number of Marathas grew. And the upshot of all of that is that it wasn't about religion, right? It was about power. Aurangzeb didn't mind if people within his empire converted to Islam most of the time, anyways. He did object occasionally, but usually didn't mind if they converted. But what he really cared about is whether they recognized Mughal authority, right? If they were rebelling against him or not. Could he collect taxes from them or not? That's what he cared about, was earthly power.
And you say something very heartening in your book that Aurangzeb increased the number of Hindus in the nobility by 50%. And Raja Raghunath, who was his finance head, and he trusted his entire finance to a Hindu. That Aurangzeb decided things on merit and not based on a person's religion. So this is quite different to how we think about Aurangzeb.
Absolutely. And I would say that Aurangzeb was completely unexceptional for his time in that. You take a character like Shivaji, who has been remade today as, some sort of Hindu nationalist warrior, which is completely ahistorical. I mean, one of his major commanders in his army was a Muslim. Religion was not the thing for these guys, right? They were kings. This making religion into the sort of the primary lens, this is our problem in the 21st century. It wasn't their problem in the 17th century.
And you also write about the Sanskrit poets recognizing and praising Aurangzeb. This could only imply that they respected him. Or was it that they were lured and bribed into singing praises for Aurangzeb?
I suppose I would say somewhere in between those two. So many Sanskrit poets, they were hired guns, right? You depended on court patronage, and the Mughal kings had patronized Sanskrit poets. My first book is about this for about 90 years, right? Starting a little bit into Akbar's reign, going up to the ascension of Aurangzeb Alamgir, and Aurangzeb cuts that off. Things have been going downhill for a while. There weren't too many Sanskrit poets left at the Mughal court, but he uses it as a way to distinguish himself from Dara Shikoh, his main competition for the throne. But after that, many Sanskrit poets, they don't get the hint. I don't know, maybe they don't think that that's the end, or maybe it's just as simple as Sanskrit poets had been writing to the reigning king for 1,500 years by this point in time, as long as there had been classical Sanskrit, essentially. And so they just kept doing it. And some of them were probably trying to get their jobs back. That didn't work. Others of them, like I said, it was probably just a sort of default. Maybe one thing that I quote in the book, and I quote it because I think it's very striking. It's early in his reign. I think it's in the 1660s. There's a Sanskrit poet that says that his tax policies are vidhivat, which means lawful. Which is a very striking contrast, of course, to how we see his later major tax policy, the reimposition of the jizya tax in 1679, depicted now.
So let's take another song break here, and we'll come back after the song. All right, we are back after the song, and I hope you'll enjoy the song too, Audrey.
Very much.
So let's talk about the translation of the Ramayana and Mahabharata. Why would Aurangzeb pay for the translation of the Ramayana and Mahabharata from the national purse? That's something that needs clarification.
Mm-hmm. So Aurangzeb did not do that. Akbar did that. So his great-grandfather did that. But that said, so for the Mahabharata, this text, it's not retranslated into Persian. People rework parts, but there's not, as far as I know, another full translation into Persian until modern times, which makes sense. It's a really long work, right? But the Ramayana, is a different story. After that's translated into Persian for the first time in the late 1580s, it goes wild, right? I mean, it's like a pre-modern bestseller, basically. And what happens is that poets keep coming along and they keep redoing it. They keep producing new Persian Ramayanas. Some of it based on Valmiki's Sanskrit text, some of it based on Tulsi Das's Hindi text, some of it just based on, sort of oral versions. We end up with over 24 distinct Persian Ramayanas by the end of pre-modernity, right, over the course of about 200 years. And a couple of those are produced during Aurangzeb Alamgir's reign, and they're dedicated to him. One of them is done in the early 18th century, right, in sort of the final years of his reign, when he's in his 80s and sort of wandering around southern India aimlessly as this sort of old, almost broken man. And one thing that signals to me is that for all the changes that Aurangzeb introduced to how Mughal rule was done, because he was different in many ways than his predecessors, for all the changes, he wasn't able to break the perceived link between the Ramayana and the Mughal king, right? You still had a poet come along and be like, oh, I'm going to write another Persian Ramayana. Obviously, we'll dedicate that to Aurangzeb Alamgir.
So coming to the present, there are some attempts being made in India to remove Mughal history from textbooks. Now, if that happens, do you think our future generations will be devoid of having access to Mughal history, and that they'll not know about this glorious chapter in Indian history?
So, historians tend to be better with the past than the future, right? I don't have a prediction. I don't have a crystal ball here. But based on other, case studies in the past, yes, it is possible to make a population ignorant of their own history. Now, Hindu nationalists are never going to be able to erase Mughal history. One sort of inadvertent side effect of the erasure of it within Indian borders will be to elevate the importance of Mughal history outside of India, right? I mean, they'll essentially cede more authority to people like me, which, I'm sure is not what they're going for here. But I think it's a potential huge loss. And, I teach in New Jersey in the United States. I have many students of South Asian heritage here. And, some have, been raised in the United States, but some come from India, right? They come for college, maybe they came in high school, whatever. There was a time when it was an advantage to come into my classes with some background in Indian history and Mughal history, and that's not always an advantage anymore, right? It essentially depends on what kind of school they went to now within India, and that's been a change we've seen in the last 5 to 7 years, and it's really sad. It's really unfortunate to see history so politicized, both because it is politicized in pursuit of terrible things, and also because history is the loser here, right? And the access of Indians to their own past is what's being lost.
I heard you say that when you fear history, you seek to control it. The British did that with Indian history. There are attempts being made at the moment to change India's history by some elements in the present dispensation. Why do you think that's happening? For instance, the Aryan invasion theory. They are saying that now that's not true, because if they say that's true, then all the Sanskrit texts, all the wisdom that we feel that is part of Hinduism was not indigenous to India, but it was imported by outsiders. So how is that happening, and why does that continue to happen?
As I see it, I think the sort of kernel of the problem with Hindu nationalism in history is that Hindu nationalism bases so much of its own internal self-justification on the past, number one, and number two, it's almost completely mythologized version of that past, right? So it's a house of cards, and that's why they go after historians like me so hard, right? Because we are that threatening and dangerous to them, because we can pull the rug out from under them. For the Aryan migration theory, I mean, that really has to do with a sort of nativism, sort of ethnic nationalism argument. We do say migration theory, not invasion theory now, but it's as ironclad a theory as we've got. The evidence is insurmountable, currently, at least. We always remain open to new discoveries, but what Hindu nationalists are doing now is they're not presenting new evidence or new discoveries. They're just screaming louder and louder and more viciously, and using more and more crass language about it. Regarding Mughal history, as I see it, it's essentially it's just sort of it's basically digging up anti-Muslim sentiments. And in some cases, it's a dog whistle, right? We hate on Aurangzeb so much, so you all can go out and hate on present-day Indian Muslims, including using deadly violence. And obviously, we've seen a huge uptick of that, even just in the last year, right, following the BJP's second victory in India. And I also think it's just if you make being Muslim the main thing, and then you just hate on Muslims, even ones that have been dead for hundreds of years, it normalizes that grammar of hate. And that sort of, this sort of false story of oppression, right? These Muslims, sort of kept us down for so long. This then, it justifies the unjustifiable, right? Which is incredible violence in the present day. So the exact terms and the outcome is a little bit different than British colonialism, but it is the same basic grammar and structure.
So this could possibly be our last question, but being prideful about your present based on the glorious history that you have, is that something that's unique to Indians? Because we derive a lot of pride that, 5,000 years ago we did this. So we are proud now rather than being proud of what we actually are. Is this unique to Indians?
No, I don't know if it's unique to Indians or not, but I do have something to say on this, which is for Indians who want to feel proud of their history, you don't need to make it up. Indian history is glorious. It is long. You go back to the Indus Valley civilization. It was one of the centers of the ancient world. In fact, it was probably the biggest center. There's incredible stuff throughout. I mean, Sanskrit literature alone is probably the largest body of literature ever produced in pre-modernity. It spread across much of Asia, not through conquest, but because people wanted it, right? They thirsted after culture developed on the subcontinent. You don't have to make this stuff up, right? You don't have to bastardize your history. And so that is a point that I feel very strongly about. Because, one can imagine a history that, I don't know, maybe you don't know much about it, or maybe there are parts that, you're not so crazy about, but Indian history isn't that. Like whatever you want, you probably have it in Indian history. It is so long and so diverse, and it's just so glorious, right? That's why a Videshi like me has become so interested and devoted my life to studying it. So for Indians who want to be proud, like look no further than the facts. You don't have to go with the Hindu nationalist mythology. Just read real history, and I think you will find incredible stuff that you should be very proud of.
And I think, Audrey, that, living in Australia, what I see is that the history that we are taught around the world is quite Eurocentric. We seem to be focusing more on Roman and Greek history and the Egyptian civilization rather than talk about the Indus Valley civilization. There's very few people in different parts of the world who know about the Indus Valley civilization, which is probably one of the biggest civilizations that's ever happened. But we seem to talk about the Egyptians and the Sumerians. And I think that's where Indians feel not recognized. Greece is called the cradle of civilizations, or so all the research and development that happened in the Indus Valley civilization is not recognized. It had a large footprint, and that's why and also historians seem to focus on Mughal history. And what an average Indian feels is that, nothing is being talked about our glorious civilization or history, but all you're talking about is the Mughal history. And these are the Mughals who came from outside, looted and plundered, and took away our riches. So I think, it's not my place to change the world. But thank you very much, and I hope we can talk to you again in future. It was a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you.
Thank you, Manbir. Bye.